Have you ever stared at the clock, heart pounding, as a deadline loomed? That terrifying finish line for a project, an assignment, or a task. We use the word deadline every day. But have you ever stopped to wonder where this intense, slightly morbid word actually comes from? You might think it's just a dramatic metaphor for a time limit, but the real story is much darker and more fascinating than you can imagine. It's a journey that takes us back to one of the most brutal periods in American history. So, grab a seat, because today we're going to uncover the chilling origins of the word deadline. To find the source, we have to travel back to the American Civil War, specifically to the 1860s. The war between the Union and the Confederacy was raging, and with it came the grim reality of prisoners of war. Conditions in these prison camps were notoriously horrific on both sides. Overcrowding, disease, and starvation were rampant. One of the most infamous of these was a Confederate prison in Georgia called Camp Sumter, better known by its haunting nickname, Andersonville. Andersonville was a nightmare brought to life. Designed to hold 10,000 Union soldiers, its population swelled to over 32,000 at its peak. The men were crammed into a 26.5-acre open-air stockade with no shelter from the scorching sun or freezing rain. The only water source was a small creek that flowed through the camp, which quickly became contaminated with human waste, serving as both a sewer and a drinking fountain. Disease ran rampant. Scurvy, dysentery, and gangrene were common killers. It was a place of unimaginable suffering. Now imagine you're a prisoner in this hellscape. Surrounding the packed enclosure was a tall wooden fence, a stockade. The guards, often young boys or old men not fit for the front lines, were stationed in watchtowers along this fence. To prevent prisoners from even attempting to climb the fence or tunnel under it, the camp commander, Captain Henry Wirtz, established a simple, brutal rule. About 19 feet inside the main stockade wall, a light fence or a simple line was drawn in the dirt, a crude boundary that ran all the way around the camp's perimeter. This line was known to the prisoners and guards as the deadline. The rule was absolute and merciless. Any prisoner who crossed this line or even so much as touched it would be shot instantly by the guards in the towers, no questions asked. There were no warnings, no second chances. Just a single step over the line meant certain death. This wasn't just an idle threat. Guards were often given extra rations or even time off for a good shot. For the thousands of starving, desperate men inside Andersonville, the deadline was a constant, terrifying reminder of their fragile existence. It was a physical boundary that separated the living from the dead. Some prisoners, unable to bear the suffering any longer, would intentionally cross the line as a form of suicide, a final, desperate act to end their misery. The term deadline wasn't a metaphor, it was a literal line of death. Think about that for a moment. The word we use so casually today for a project due date was born from a line in the mud that meant the difference between life and death for over 30,000 men. The psychological weight of that line must have been immense. It was a constant visual representation of the guards' lethal authority and the prisoners' utter powerlessness. After the Civil War ended, the horrors of Andersonville came to light. The camp's commander, Captain Wirtz, was arrested, tried, and executed for war crimes, partly due to the cruelty of the deadline rule. The stories of the survivors, filled with accounts of starvation, disease, and the ever-present threat of the deadline, were published and widely circulated. The term, seared into the nation's memory, began to slowly seep into the public consciousness. So, how did a word with such a grim and specific origin story become a common term for a time limit? The transition happened gradually, over several decades. The first stop on its journey into civilian language was, perhaps unsurprisingly, the world of printing and publishing. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the newspaper industry was a fast-paced, high-pressure environment. To print a newspaper, large metal plates were used. The text was set in metal type, locked into a frame called a chase, and this entire assembly had to be ready by a specific time to start the printing presses. The area on the printing press bed beyond which the typecase could not go was sometimes referred to as the deadline. If the type extended past this line, it wouldn't print correctly, effectively killing that part of the page. While this printing usage is interesting, the more direct evolution of the meaning we know today came from the journalism slang that followed. By the early 1920s, deadline was being used by reporters and editors not for a physical line on a press, but for a time limit. It was the final moment a story could be submitted to make it into the next edition. The pressure was immense. If you missed the deadline, your story was dead. It wouldn't be published. The metaphorical connection is powerful. Just like crossing the line at Andersonville had an irreversible final consequence, missing a reporter's deadline meant your work was finished, useless for that day's paper. The term perfectly captured the high-stakes, time-sensitive nature of the news business. It carried a sense of urgency and finality that other words like due date or time limit just didn't have. It had teeth. From the newsroom, the word deadline exploded into the broader culture. As the 20th century progressed, the pace of business and life in general accelerated. The concepts of project management, efficiency, and time-based targets became central to almost every industry. Offices, factories, and eventually schools all needed a word to describe these crucial time limits. Deadline was the perfect fit. Its dramatic, slightly intimidating tone actually made it more effective. Telling someone a report is due on Friday sounds like a suggestion. Telling them the deadline is Friday sounds like a command. It implies a non-negotiable endpoint with real consequences for failure, even if those consequences are just a bad grade or a disappointed boss, not a guard's bullet. So, the word traveled from a prisoner of war camp to the printing press, to the newsroom, and finally into our everyday vocabulary. It's a testament to how language evolves, taking words from very specific, often dark, contexts and adapting them for general use. The original meaning gets diluted over time, but a shadow of its intensity remains. Today, we face deadlines for everything: filing taxes, applying for jobs, submitting school papers, completing work projects, even renewing a library book. We talk about meeting deadlines, missing deadlines, and pushing back deadlines. The word has become so common that we rarely, if ever, think about its brutal origin, but knowing its history adds a new layer of perspective. The next time you're feeling stressed about a looming deadline, take a second to remember Andersonville. Remember that for thousands of men, the deadline wasn't about a report or a project. It was a literal line in the dirt, a boundary between a horrific life and an instant death. It's a sobering thought, and maybe, just maybe, it can make our modern-day deadlines feel just a little less terrifying. It reminds us that while the pressure we feel is real, the stakes are, thankfully, much, much lower. The history of this simple word is a powerful reminder of the human cost of conflict and the incredible journey language can take through history. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the story behind the word deadline. If you found this as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories behind the words we use every day. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Until next time, stay curious.